Hey guys, what's up? Mr. Brotherton here, and we're going to be talking about cell signaling and communication. This is the concept 3 notes for Unit 3, which is about homeostasis and body systems. All right, so when I think of cell signaling and communication, I usually think of the game Mousetrap. All right, you might be asking yourself, why does this guy have mousetraps on here? The reason for this is when we think about how things happen with your body, like how is it that I'm able to talk so quickly, or how is it that I'm able to move my hands all around like this, you probably think it's pretty straightforward that you just make it happen and your body just makes it happen. It's kind of like how a normal mousetrap works, right? Where if a mouse presses the lever, then you have an immediate reaction. It's not like that at all. It's really, really complicated to do something as simple as move your arm. And all of that happens through all of these different chain events and these chain reactions, like the board game Mousetrap, or like a Rube Goldberg machine, where one thing happens over here and you were trying to do something maybe over here, and it takes a long time and it has to go through all these different steps to get there. So let's kind of take a look at what we're talking about here. All right, so what's the overview here? Well, the overview is that your brain is pretty much in control of all of the signaling that happens in your body. That's the kind of the control center, and it's kind of taking in all of the information from the rest of your body and integrating it and processing it. All right, so it receives sensory input. It's going to integrate that information. That means it's going to process it and kind of decide what to do. And then it has to send signals back out to the rest of the body to tell your body what to do. Now, the endocrine system is also very important for being a control center here, but we're mainly going to focus on the nervous system. All right. So complex multicellular organisms like you and me, they need to be able to communicate from one cell to another cell to be like, hey, there's something happening here. There's a stimulus happening here. You need to respond. You need to do something. And how do they do that? They do it by sending messages to one another. All right. So cell signaling allows your cells to process information from their environment. That stimuli we talked about, that's a condition for life. It has to be able to respond to stimuli, right? So we do that through cell signaling. I mean, this can be chemical or physical stimuli like heat or light, or a chemical stimuli like the neurotransmitters that your body uses to communicate between neurons, or other chemical things like, I don't know, you're eating a delicious donut and now your body's like, oh man, I'm tasting sugar, so it releases an enzyme to break down that sugar. And all of that's happening through chemical and electrical signals. All right. Now, this is an important word for you to know, and the word is ligand. So what's a ligand? It's basically a molecule that binds to another molecule, a receptor, and it signals. So it kind of works like this. If my hand here is a receptor, my fist here would be a ligand. So this is basically a ligand is a generic name for any protein that is able to bind to another protein. Right? So here is our ligand, or the signal, and here is our receptor. All right. So what does this look like at the cellular level? So we're starting to zoom in now. What does this look like at the cellular level? Well, it's basically a sequence of events that's initiated by our initial signal, and it leads to a response. So like when I need to move my arm like this, all we think about is, here's the response, my arm's moving. But there's a whole bunch of stuff that happens before I can do that. All right. So it involves a signal, it involves a receptor, and it involves a response. So the signal, and then our message is transduced. The word transduction basically means to move something across or kind of translate it into something else. And then we get to our desired response. So here is what that looks like if we're looking at a cell. All right, so here's outside of our cell, here's inside of our cell, and it happens in 4 basic steps, which we'll dive into next. But if you look at this, here's our ligand, our signal, right? Here it's some kind of molecule or protein. It's binding to this receptor. That signal is getting turned into possibly other little signals here in our cell, and then we're getting the desired response. So let's talk about what that looks like. So we're going to focus on the signal first. All right, So chemical signals come in a couple different shapes and varieties. The first one is an autocrine signal. And so an autocrine signal is where the signal here is going to affect the same cell that releases it. So it's a self signal, auto, right? So the signal's released, you can see it there, and then it's going to be picked up by a receptor on the same cell. So the signaling cell is the target cell here. What's another type of chemical signal? This is a paracrine signal. So it diffuses to nearby cells. An example of this is neurotransmitters moving between neurons. So let's see what this looks like. We have a cell over here, we have a signal, and the signal is going to float over here or diffuse over here and get picked up by this receptor. So here's our signaling cell, and there's our target cell. So that's a paracrine signal. What's another type of signal? This is a juxtacrine signal. So this is requiring direct contact between a signaling cell and a receiving cell. So here's our signaling cell. You can see our signal right here, and you can see the receptor of this guy is touching this guy. All right, so here's our signaling cell, and here's our target cell. We tend to not do this type of cell signaling that much. Bacteria do it a lot. One area where we do this, though, is actually there are parts of your brain and parts of your body that need to send signals so fast that neurons are actually totally touching each other. So instead of having to jump a gap there and communicate with each other, it can actually just go straight through this thing called a gap junction. So it's kind of like if you send a message that starts one place, it can instantaneously appear really, really far away through these juxtacrine signals. All right, what's another one that we've already talked about? Hormones are also a chemical signal, and they travel to distant cells. All right, this is also known as endocrine signaling. How's that work? Well, we've kind of talked about this before. The signal goes into your blood vessel, and then the blood vessel transports it throughout the body, and a receptor on your target cell picks it up. All right, so that's how the endocrine system is able to control a lot of things that happen in your body as well. So now let's talk about the receptor. So the really cool thing about receptors is they generally are proteins where the signal is received and is able to be picked up. So remember in our first thing we talked about, this is a ligand and my hand would be the receptor. And so there's a couple different kinds. There's intracellular receptors. So intra means inside. So these are going to be located inside the cell. So the ligands for an intracellular receptor has to be able to diffuse across our cell membrane and get inside of our cell. All right. And these tend to be really small things. And generally they are hormones. Hormones a lot of times act inside the cell. So they're able to get through our cell membrane and start turning on genes. Another kind, if we have intracellular, well, there's going to be ones that operate outside the cell. So these are going to be receptors that hang out on our membranes. Okay, they're located on the surface of the cell, and these tend to be large and polar, so that means they have a charge, so it's difficult for them to get inside of our cell membrane. The other thing, receptors, like all proteins, have a highly specific shape. Okay, so only certain ligands can bind to certain receptors. If the receptor could be triggered by any old molecule, the body would have a lot of problems. So here's an example. We have our signal here in yellow, and our receptor has to be able to fit that signal inside of it in order to kind of send this message along. Whereas here, these ones don't work, so you're not going to send that message. All right. What else about receptors? So generally receptors, the bond of the signal to that receptor is going to be non-covalent. So remember, a covalent bond is where things share electrons. They're almost like overlapping. So this is non-covalent. So it's usually like an attraction between charges. Maybe it's like an ionic bond or even a hydrogen bond, which is like kind of a weak bond where charges are attracted to each other. And that makes it reversible. So the receptor can keep getting used over and over again, which is really cool. So this lets the signal be regulated more easily. And one of the ways we can regulate our receptors is actually through inhibitors. So when we kind of talked about our feedback loops, remember certain inhibitors can cause negative feedback. So it can bring our reaction down to something, and that's what's happening here. So really a good example of this is caffeine. Caffeine is the most widely used psychoactive substance on planet Earth, and caffeine, if you look here, it's shaped really similarly to this other thing called adenosine. So adenosine makes up this other thing called ATP, and ATP is a molecule that gives us energy, right? We break it down and we can use that energy to power everything we do in our body. But when we get really tired, you have all this adenosine left over from breaking down all that stuff. And so adenosine attaches to receptors in your brain, and your body's like, man, we have all this adenosine, we're sleepy. What does caffeine do? Caffeine blocks that receptor, and so caffeine doesn't actually give you energy. Caffeine blocks the thing that tells you you're tired, all right? Which is pretty cool. All right, so what's our next step here? That is transduction. So what's up with transduction? This is kind of the complicated part of this whole thing. So what does transduction means? It means you're passing along that signal that you sent until the desired response is reached. So, sorry guys, this can be a long process or a short process. And a lot of times there's a whole cascade of little molecules bumping into other ones, enzymes grabbing things, moving things, changing things, etc. So this is really the mousetrap part of this whole thing. And generally passing along that message from our receptor to something happening inside the cell usually happens through changing the shape of different proteins. Remember, structure dictates function. So if you change the shape of something, now you've changed its function. All right. So you can kind of turn proteins on and off. And that usually involves adding this little thing here, which is a phosphate group. So you don't need to know this as kind of an AP Bio thing, but I just want you to be aware of what's going on here. So a lot of times transduction is happening through phosphorylation using kinase enzymes. And what that means is you're adding a phosphate to a protein. Or you can dephosphorylize something, which is the removal of a phosphate group through phosphatase enzymes. Well, how does that turn these things on and off? Well, guess what? Phosphate groups have a negative charge, and remember, charges are attracted to each other. So say you have a amino acid that's kind of shaped like my hand here, and then you take a phosphate group that has a negative charge on here and you stick it to it. Well, if my elbow maybe has a positive charge, now this protein is going to start changing shape, and this negative charge is going to want to interact with this positive charge where my elbow is, and now we've changed the shape of our protein and we can do different stuff. All right. So what else is going on with transduction? A lot of times you're in the mousetrap situation where it sends the message along and along and along, and you have these secondary messengers that ultimately create the response. So this is like a small molecule that serves as an intermediate between that receptor and kind of the cascade of responses that happen after. This is really good for regulation. If everything just went A to B, it would be hard to have those negative feedback loops that turn things off. So this allows you to inhibit these signal transmissions because things could really get out of control. All right. So what's a really good example of this is epinephrine and the fight or flight response. So if you're in a situation where you either need to put up or shut up, right? You're gonna run away, or you have to fight something. Your body, your endocrine system releases a bunch of epinephrine, and that activates this thing called CAMP in your muscles, and CAMP basically tells your muscles to break down glucose. So if you break down glucose, now you can do cellular respiration. That's what gives you energy. So now you have a whole bunch of extra energy flooding your muscles, and maybe you've got to punch a shark, or maybe you just need to run away. All right. So this is a really good example of a secondary messenger. All right, so what's the last thing that can happen here is the response. All right, ultimately, this is what the signal is trying to tell the body to do. It's trying to trigger something to happen. All right, so the same signal can cause many different responses, such as the opening of ion channels. So this is where a membrane kind of changes charges. All right, and you can alter gene expression, which is what the endocrine system is doing a lot of times, so genes may be switched on or off. We kind of talked about this before, but maybe if like you drink a bunch of milk, now you have a bunch of lactose in your body, and you know your body might be like, crap, we have to turn on genes for lactase, which is an enzyme to break down all this milk, right? So, and it can also change enzyme activity. So it can inhibit enzymes. It can change their shape so they can't work, or maybe it can turn them on and they'll go to town and start doing a whole bunch of stuff. So let's talk about a specific case of transmission here. So we started, or signal and cell signaling. So we started this whole thing talking about the nervous system is the ultimate control center. Well, guess what? It does that through these things called neurotransmitters. So our signal here is a neurotransmitter. We have about over 100 or so different neurotransmitters. And so this thing goes across this gap here, which is called a synapse. And here's our receptor on the other side of our neurotransmitter. And the nervous system is the big control center for all of this stuff. So what happens if we kind of mess up that signal there? Or what happens if we mess up that receptor on the other side of our synapse here? You know, what could go wrong with the intended response? So let's talk about what the nervous system looks like. It's broken into two parts: the central nervous system, that's your brain and spinal cord, and that's kind of the control center we talked about at the very beginning of this. And then there's the peripheral nervous system. So outside, periphery, it means something kind of far away. So this is outside the central nervous system. And that's going to be like your nerves that connect to your spinal cord. So that's the communication system between your central nervous system and everything else that's happening out here. All right. And what's really cool about the central nervous system in the brain is that your neurons, your nerve cells that we're talking about here, they can last a lifetime. So once they grow, they don't divide and keep reproducing. So if you mess up your neurons, it's really, really bad. All right, because they do not grow and make copies of themselves throughout your life. All right, so let's talk about what happens here if we mess up the peripheral nervous system. All right, so the peripheral nervous system is basically the communication between the body and your central nervous system. It has two types of neurons, your sensory neurons and your motor neurons. And if you damage a sensory neuron, so your ability to feel something, it's going to be impaired. You no longer feel it where your neuron is damaged. So a couple months ago, I actually damaged a bunch of neurons in my hand here, and I couldn't feel my pinky or this finger. Okay, so what also happens, you can also damage your motor neurons, which means you won't be able to contract your muscles. So in that same instance, I also damaged some motor neurons. And so when I went to go close these fingers, when I went to go close my hand, this is what would happen. Only these ones would close and these ones wouldn't do anything. So peripheral nervous system damage is very, very common if in diseases like diabetes, right? Because it causes neuropathy where you can't feel your limbs, and that usually happens in the hands and feet. Okay, so what happens if we mess up the central nervous system? Well, the central nervous system, remember, it's made of these things called interneurons, and this is where you're integrating all of that information you're getting from your body, all right? And what can go wrong if the part of your brain or the part of your nervous system that's supposed to make sense of everything happening to your body? Well, you get sensory processing disorders where you have disorganized, chaotic firing of all of those neurons, and you can get a traffic jam or an inappropriate motor and behavior response. Worse than that, though, is if you mess up these neurotransmitters, etc., you can have failure of smooth muscle, failures of your heart, okay? Failures in breathing, failures in your ability to swallow. Your metabolism will stop working. Your limbic system, which regulates kind of your emotions, will stop working, and your glands of your endocrine system will also stop working. So you don't want to mess up your central nervous system. And all of that's controlled, all of that cell signaling in your nervous system is controlled by these guys, these neurotransmitters. So these are really what's controlling homeostasis and cell signaling throughout your nervous system. And if you change these or their receptors, or you increase the release of neurotransmitters, you can have effects throughout your entire body. All right, so that's it for today, guys. Stay curious. Bye.